Okay, well, we're putting a lot in here this morning, and so hopefully I'll have enough time to put all that we have this morning. So this morning we have a biography, and we have several biographies throughout our month here, but this morning we're going to be looking at a man by the name of Adoniram Judson. And some of you, how many have heard of this missionary before? A couple, just how many? Handful, okay. And so we're going to look at him, trying to get my stuff up here. It'll be helpful. There we go. And this is what we're going to look at this morning. And I think that, I hope by the time we're done with this, and I'll, because of time, I'll have to scurry along here because it's a lot to put into a short time of a man whose lifespan reached so many people, yet doing so, the consequences of his mission and to his life were, to us, would be insurmountable to many of us. And so as we get into this, we look at this man, and those who don't know him, if they were to go to Malden, Massachusetts, it's a picturesque town, suburb of Boston. You may find in that town that I'm on here. Am I on my machine here? Here we go. He should have yelled at me. You would find a marble tablet bearing this description or inscription. In memorandum, Reverend Adoniram Judson, born August 9, 1788, died April 12, 1850. Malden, his birthplace. The ocean, his sepulcher. Converted Burmans and the Burman Bible. His monument, his record, is on high. Adoniram Judson was not a household name, or really isn't today, as not many have heard of him, but the name is a name remembered among the Burmese people, known now as modern-day Myanmar. Here on the map, you might notice here, it's very close to Cambodia. It's in Southeast Asia. There, off of India to the left, and this is where Burma is. This is in the news still constantly because of the consequence of living there and the persecution that goes on there. It's modern day today called Yangon, and so this is where Adoniram and his wife Ann Judson, a tremendous missionary in her own right, his first wife settled and took the gospel to the Burmese people of India. And Adoniram was the son of a congregational pastor, but later became a Baptist, and he was exceptionally gifted. In fact, that he was reading at 3 years old. He could read the Bible at 3 years old. He was exceptional with language, which God used that, and by the time he was old enough to go to school, the other students had nicknamed him Virgil. And the reason they called him Virgil was because he could read and write Greek and Latin. He was exceptionally good at arithmetic as well. It was easy for him. In fact, as soon as the teacher started writing things down, he already had the answer. He was exceptionally smart. Yet, like so many young people, this did not mean that he knew what he wanted to do with his life. When he was 16, he entered college. And Adoniram's father was a graduate from Yale University, interesting. And they lived in New Haven, Connecticut, and it was a long ways from Plymouth. And he looked for a college closer to home for his eldest son to attend. Interestingly, Harvard University was 50 miles to the north, but Adoniram's father was not impressed with the religious education given there. It was too watered down, he said, for his liking. This is in the early 1800s already. Eventually, he was decided that Adoniram would go to attend Rhode Island, later to become known as Brown University. And it was 50 miles south. And there, just because there was religious education, just because you go to a Christian school, didn't mean that all were Christians. And he ran into a young man there by the name of Jacob Eames. Jacob was a deist, and he shared his beliefs with Adoniram, and Adoniram thought that, it made a lot of sense what he said, and he decided he was going to become a deist as well. A deist is one who believes that that there are other religions in the world that not one's more specific or greater than the other. They believe in God, but God had little to no interest in the lives of people. And as a deist, Jacob did not, as Jacob and Adoniram talked about what they believed, deism began to make a lot of sense to Adoniram. So he changed, as I said, he changed his beliefs. And he decided to keep it a secret, especially from his parents, because that would end his college career right then and there. And so, as we know, the truth eventually comes out. It always comes out. And it did. When Adoniram graduated, he graduated at the top of his class. When he returned home, he had no plans. He didn't know what he was going to do. So he began to teach, and he began and started a small school, which was very productive, named Plymouth Independent Academy. And dismayed by the poor quality of the textbooks available to the students, he wrote 2 texts of his own, Elements of English Grammar and The Young Lady's Arithmetic. Both of them were immediately published by Brown University. So here he is, a young man, published. And he was growing restless on his future. He was still worldly. He wanted to go out and explore the things that him and Jacob Eames talked about and dreamed about together. And so Adoniram decided to quit his teaching and decided to go to New York. He wanted to be a playwright, thought he would be a famous playwright because he had mastered, so he thought, the English language. When he told his parents, they obviously forbade it and encouraged him to continue on in his studies, and if he didn't like it, become a pastor. And that brought out within him to reveal that he didn't believe what they believed, that he was a deist. And like any good pastor and father, his dad said, "Give me the name of the professor who did this to you. I will string him up by his thumbs." I was like, whew. Those Congregationalists. In his mind, it was made up. I'm leaving. So he left for New York with his inheritance of a horse, and he would ride to Sheffield and spend the night with his uncle Ephraim, and there leave his horse and walk into Albany, New York. And his time there was short-lived. He found out that it was a little bit rougher to become a playwright than he thought, and he was living in poverty. It was almost like the prodigal son, and he became wayward. He would go out and he would join up with a band of other misfits, and they would go and take a night stay, but slip out in the middle of the night and not pay the rent or pay the cost. And so that happened for some time, and finally he decided to go home. Going back to retrieve his horse, he stopped there at his uncle's house, and there he didn't find his uncle, but he found a young minister. His uncle was a pastor as well, and the young minister was filling in. And he had a long conversation with that young minister, which challenged him and his heart concerning his beliefs. From there, he went and making his way to Plymouth, and some know this little story, but this is very profound. He stopped at a tavern and an inn which had no rooms to rent, and the only room that he could find, ultimately there, the inn owner said, "There's only a room, and there's a sick man there. There's a partition between by sheet, if you don't mind. There's a bed." He says, "I don't mind." He says, "There'll be groaning. He'll be tended all night. He's very sick." And he said, "I will not even blink because I'm so tired." Well, that was not so. All night the man groaned, and with caregivers coming in and going, and Adoniram found himself thinking about the man in the other half of the room. Who was he? Had he done everything he wanted to in his life? Did he know he was dying, and did he fear death? Then he began asking himself the same questions. In the dark, miles from home, and without any plan for his future, he began to wonder. Adoniram's deist beliefs, which he had seemed so fine in college, were empty and joyless. He thought about the younger pastor at his uncle's house and envied the man's sense of peace and joy and purpose of life. And after a while, he switched back in his thoughts to the dying man. Where would he be buried? Did he believe in life after death? Or did he think his soul would rot right along with his body? After letting his mind wander down these paths for nearly an hour, Adoniram came to his senses. What was he thinking? He was an intelligent young man, college valedictorian, and winner of debates and arguments. He could almost hear Jacob Eames laughing at him for struggling and indulging in such pointless thinking. At 4 a.m., the groans stopped next door, and Adoniram got some sleep. He woke up late the next morning, went downstairs, wondering if there was any breakfast left, and then he inquired about the man next door, how he was doing, and the innkeeper replied, dead. He died about 4 this morning, when Adoniram was able to go to sleep. Adoniram responded he's sorry to hear he died, and asked, who was he anyway? And the innkeeper replied, a smart young man, by all accounts. They said he had been to college in Providence, Brown University, he says, I think. And Adoniram felt the goosebumps rising in the back of his neck. Do you know his name? He asked soberly. Of course, I had to send notice to his parents. His name was Jacob Eames. Adoniram was greatly shocked. He sat by the fire staring. Cold oatmeal beside him, not eating it at all. And he couldn't imagine that this was Jacob Eames. All the dreams that they had. And here he was, his close friend next door to him, right next behind a sheet. And he couldn't talk to him, didn't encourage him, didn't ask him. Wasn't there for him. And he died. His thoughts were overwhelmed with where Jacob would spend eternity. Coming home, Adoniram was beginning to be pulled or felt pulled toward Christianity, back to his roots, which would provide so many answers to the questions about having peace and purpose. But he had a well-trained mind, and would not yield to the things that didn't seem logical to him. And there were just too many unanswered questions for him to throw his lot in with his parents' religion. At that time, a visit was made to his house by Dr. Stewart and another man named Dr. Griffin, well-respected pastors in the area, both graduates from Yale University. They came to discuss some final plans as they were invited to teach and help with the opening of a seminary at Andover, Massachusetts. And as they were there, Adoniram just sat there and piled question after question at them, which led to more questions. And by the end of the night, they which was an unusual invitation, they invited Adoniram to come and study at the university as an unbeliever, to study the Christian faith. And so he did. December 2nd, 1808, Adoniram quietly came to, at that time after studying, came to the conclusion that the Bible was correct and that he should commit his life to Christ. And he did there all alone by himself. It was the first time in his life that he'd recall he felt free. It was not his father's faith in God he was relying on now, but his own. But what would his future be? What would he do? Well, at that time, not too long ago, there was an event called, I think, the Haystack Prayer Meeting, and where God laid upon several men's heart missions. And so it was, those men were intertwined with Adoniram, and Adoniram began to have a heart for missions, and he had a heart to go to the heathen. And his heart was turned toward Asia. His heart was turned toward the area of India, and ultimately the Burmese people. Adoniram graduated from the top of his class again, and he was offered lucrative opportunities for pastoral ministry as an associate. And his family was so excited about it. His sister was elated, his brother, and he told them, that's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to the mission field. And you got to understand, at that time, there was no missions agency. The United States, The Americas were not mission-oriented. The churches were not mission-oriented outside the country. There was no mission sending. And so it was that this was a shock to his parents. And they ultimately tried to discourage him. They were very distraught about it. But Adoniram had his mind set up. He worked with the congregational churches to start a missions sending, which later he left, and the Baptist actually entrusted the Lord as he became Baptist in his theology, and was very convicted about it. And yet, while he was there and preparing to go and doing all this, he was alone. And a young lady he met at a gathering caught his heart. Her name was Anne Hasseltine. And he couldn't get her out of his mind. And he began to correspond with her. And he asked her if she was willing to formally commence in acquaintanceship, which meant he was interested in her to start thinking about marriage, courtship, basically. And she took a week to respond because she didn't want him to think that she was too eager. And so she sent a letter to him and said, "You'll have to ask my father." And you might have read this before, but this is the letter that he sent her father in asking the hand of his daughter. It says this, if you can read that: "I have now to ask whether you can consent to part with your daughter early next spring, to see her no more in this world, whether you can consent to her departure and her subjection to the hardships and suffering of a missionary life, whether you can consent to her exposure to the dangers of the ocean, to the fatal influence of the southern climate of Burma, to every kind of want and distress, to degradation, degradation and insult, persecution, and perhaps a violent death. Can you consent to all of this for the sake of him who left his heavenly home and died for her and for you, for the sake of perishing immortal souls, for the sake of Zion, the glory of God?" Question. Now think about it as a father and your daughter, and you get a letter from a young man who says, "I want your daughter's hand." You may never see her again. The place we're going is peril. She may die there. And we know that she did, as we'll find out. Her father said, "It's up to Anne," and Anne, without hesitation, said yes. Here they were in their 20s, 23 and 24, heading to the mission field. They were married February 5th, 1812. 13 days later, on February 18th, they boarded the ship to head to Burma. 114 days they arrived off the coast of India. There they met the famous William Carey. William Carey, as we know, advised them they wanted to go to Rangoon, advised them that was their destination, advised them not to. That it ultimately was a death wish. The place was hostile. Just by pointing your feet, and just the customs, you could offend somebody and they could put you to death. In fact, it would be considered probably a closed, as a closed nation. You can go to Burma today, but it's with great risk of life. It's very dangerous. William Carey told Judson in India a few months earlier not to go there today. He said today it probably, as I said, would be considered a closed country. And so this did not deter Adoniram or Anne. In fact, they ministered together through what 99.9% of any of us today would even think about. And as we go on and read the testimony of their life here in the next few minutes, I want you to think about the things you complain about. And I want you to think about the things that you're unwilling to do because it's just too much. It's too much of a sacrifice. Immediately, they experienced resistance. The East India Company branded them as undesirables and ordered them to return to the U.S. Yet by God's providence and how he would have it, they found themselves in Rangoon, where they wanted to be. Modern day, again, which I showed earlier, Rangoon, there, right there in the bay, it goes up the river. But it was the beginning of the many difficulties. Anne was pregnant with their first child and gave birth on the ship to Rangoon on their trip there when they were there. And it was a stillborn birth. They never named the child. Settling in Rangoon, they began a lifelong battle in 108-degree heat and cholera, malaria, dysentery, and unknown miseries, including later, as we'll get to, hopefully, Adoniram was imprisoned. Anne would bury all three of her children. The second, Roger William, lived only a year, and the last, Maria Elizabeth, only 2 years, 3 months. With heartache, there was much joy in the ministry, though God was providentially working, and the Judsons with their other missionary colleagues, all in their 20s, when they arrived, made many inroads into the gospel. In 1818, Adoniram purchased a plot of land on the road to the Shuadagan Pagoda, which it's still there today. It's an ancient temple believed to house relics of Buddha. But pilgrimages were made there. Thousands of people had walked this street, and so he bought this piece of property to build a zayat, which is an open air building. So you're walking in, people would walk by, he would call out, they'd come in and rest, and it was an opportunity to share the gospel, not only then there, but also a printing press arrived by one of the new missionaries that came with them, and they began printing tracts, several tracts, thousands of them, that they would share the gospel with at the printing press. And 9 years in, he had his first convert. And the work was growing with constant challenges, always the knowledge that things could change in a moment depending on the viceroy's mood. Those were the leaders over the province. In 1820, Anne had become sick, and decision was made to voyage to the coast of Calcutta and find a doctor. And a doctor diagnosed her with liver disease. And diagnoses were very vague. It was more of observation and science. And so he told her that it would be better for her to return to the States. They stayed on at Calcutta for a while. She got better, and went back to Rangoon, and her health turned again for the worse. Decided to go and back. She decided to go back. He left her. She went alone to the U.S. to get healthy, and she was gone 2 years. Can you imagine your spouse leaving you for 2 years? You didn't know. Ships. A lot of missionaries didn't make it to the mission field because the ships were not like your Uber, okay? The trip was hard. Sometimes you had to strap yourself in your bed because it was so rough, the seas, for days. So they'd be separated for 2 years. In a letter, Adoniram describes the feeling the feeling of her being gone as being as painful and crippling as having his arm amputated. During this time, Adoniram toiled to translate the New Testament. And he would translate both the New Testament and the Old Testament from the original Greek and from the original Hebrew. In January 1823, Anne returned, and a decision was made to move to Ava, which is north up to by the capital. If you can see that, it's a hard one, but it's up there where the circle is. And leaving newly arrived missionaries to continue the work in Rangoon. And after settling in Ava, rumors began to spread of war with Britain. And on Sunday, May 23rd, 1824, the rumors turned to fact. And those who were British or any foreigners or Americans were considered questionable with suspicion. And on June 8th, 1824, Adoniram was arrested. Immediately he was taken with others. He was put into leg irons with a chain, which would be his basic jewelry for the next 11 months. They would take him into the hut every night. They would take him and put that chain around a long bamboo. They would all line up and they burned the bamboo, and they would raise their feet above the ground just so the shoulder blades and their head would touch the ground. Every night they would do that. Anne would come and bring food to him because that was the only way that they could eat. And they were dying of starvation, many of them, in these gulags, basically, ran by tyrants they called the spotted faces, who themselves committed crimes, were used to tend to the prisoners. The spot on their face would be a symbol of what their crime was. Adoniram's only concern was for the safety of Anne and his translation of the New Testament. Anne had first buried it with their savings in the ground, and she came and corresponded with Adoniram and asked about it. Adoniram says, the gold will keep, the pages of Scripture will not. And he advised her to go get the lumpiest pillow she could find and hide the manuscript in it. The New Testament was completed, and bring it to him so he had it, so he could keep it with him. That's how important it was to him. Well, after, I believe it was 11 months, they moved them to a different facility. In fact, they had to hike miles. So you can imagine having nothing on your feet, walking barefoot for miles, and they were malnutrition. They could hardly do it. They were chained, roped to another prisoner. In fact, it was so bad and so painful for him. His feet were bleeding. He wanted to throw himself off a bridge, but he couldn't because someone was tied, just to relieve the pain. Finally, they were exhausted. They had to be taken by carts to the final destination, where they would remain until they were released later. But there, the conditions were worse. There was a hut with a roof that was caved in, and still they had the bamboo tradition of raising their feet up, but their feet were now bloody. And the roof was open, and guess what? There was many mosquitoes. The mosquitoes began to eat. They couldn't do anything about it. Their pain was excruciating. One day, by God's grace, there was a row outside. It was a lion. And the lion was in a cage, and they thought for sure now they're going to feed us to the lions. They always thought that they were going to be killed somehow, because they would go out in the courtyards and for the day, and they could hear screaming and torturing of people. And they thought for sure they're going to feed us to the lions. Well, that lion could hear them, pretty soon there's no more. The lion starved to death. Well, he had a big cage, and Adoniram worked it out so that he could actually be kept in the cage, where his feet didn't have to be put up and he could lay down. The Lord provided that for him. Well, the war ended. But during that time, while he was in prison, there was a greater concern, because Anne had been pregnant. She was pregnant when he went in, and 9 months later, while he was in prison, she gave birth to Maria Elizabeth. A little note was slipped into him and says, "Maria Elizabeth Butterworth Judson, born today. Thank God we are both alive. Love, Anne." And so relief washed over Adoniram, but again, it wasn't over. After months of torturous existence, they were released. The war was over. And Adoniram and Anne were kept by the British to basically, because they understood Burmese, and they were able to work out the peace treaty and settle the conditions. After this was over, trying to skip a bunch of stuff because of time here. So after this is over, it wasn't over for them as they were there with the Brits. They were able to move down and move, and yet he was asked again to do something that the Indian Trading Company, The India Trading Company wanted him to basically help negotiate and write out a treaty. He didn't want to for trading. He didn't want to, but they made the opportunity for him irresistible, because he said they would promote and try to put in a treaty freedom of religion. And so he did, and he was gone. He went. It took longer than he thought. And while he was gone, his concerns, because his letters were coming from Anne, she was getting sicker. Adoniram would never see Anne again alive. A letter came with the black wax seal on it, and it was a day he would never forget. His love of his life was gone. No longer among us, it said. She is no more. Adding to this, 6 months to the day after Anne's death, Maria died. She was 2 years and 3 months old. She was buried alongside her mother. Several months later, Adoniram received a letter that his father died. Also, still more difficult to cope as he continued on, he got another letter. His brother died at 35, and his widow died, and her daughter died. Death was all around him. This would send him in a great depression. In fact, he went out into the jungle to a little hut. He did nothing. He actually had a hole dug beside the hut for his grave. And again, God working, sent other missionaries with another printing press. And it turned him in his sights on translation to translate the Old Testament. Might be a question as well. What happened to the New Testament? Well, in God's providence, as it would have, as they both returned back, him and Anne, before she died, one of his converts was there, and a friend there in Ava wanted to find something to remember his friend by, so he went back to the prison, and he found a pillow thrown outside the walls of the prison in the mud. And he began to punch around it, and he felt something hard in it. It was the New Testament. God had spared and preserved the New Testament. Adoniram would, just in a nutshell, Adoniram would live on. He would marry 2 more times, losing his second wife. And he would not outlast his third wife, having several more children, six to a woman named Sarah Boardman, and then 2 to his last wife, Emily Chubbuck. And both of her children would eventually, I believe, die. We ask, how could Adoniram stand and take on this great task? How could he remain there? Why would he do such a thing? It's because of his belief in God's sovereignty and the gospel of Christ and what the Lord did for him. He wrote this later in his life. He says, "If I had not felt certain the very traditional trial was ordered by infinite love and mercy, I could not have survived my accumulated sufferings, which were immense." Think about the things we complain about. That faith, which consists merely in correct belief of doctrine of grace, prompts no self-denial. That prompts no self-denial is no faith at all. Do you ever think about your faith? Do you ever think about self-denial? What the Lord wants, not what you want? Or is it all about self and the things you want? John Piper writes this: Judson went there with his 23-year-old wife of 17 months. He was 24 years old, and he worked there 38 years until his death at age 61. With one trip home to New England after 30 years, the price he paid was immense. He was a seed that fell into the ground and died again and again. And the fruit of God is celebrated even in scholarly works like David Barrett's World Christian Encyclopedia. The largest Christian force in Burma is the Burma Baptist Convention, which owes its origin to the pioneering activity of the American Baptist missionary Adoniram Judson. At the time, at the turn from the second to the third millennium, Patrick Johnstone estimated that Myanmar, Burma is a new name, Burma's new name, Baptist Convention, to be 3,700 congregations with over 500,000 members and 1,900,000 affiliates, the fruit of this dead seed. When we think about the gospel and think about our own hearts, we're reminded of the words of the Apostle Paul quoting from Joel and Isaiah. He says, whoever believes and whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. How then will they call upon him whom they have not believed? And how will they believe in him whom they have not heard? And how will they hear without a preacher? How will they preach unless they are sent? Just as is written, Isaiah says, he quotes Isaiah, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news of good things. And it doesn't mean they'll all believe. In fact, he goes on and he says, as Isaiah goes on there later, that who believed your report? Who believed the report? And he goes on and says, faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. And we watch as we send out missionaries, as Trevor from our church, and Todd, and Jen, and Trevor, don't want to miss Haley and the kids. And we are here, and we need to be mindful. That's why we have the missions conference, to bring our minds back to what is the priority. And we live in a dark world, as Trevor said this week. We're a nation of death and hate. You have to believe the gospel is being heralded. And we can either remain silent and afraid, or we can be bold. Adoniram, Judson and his colleague actually went to the capital, went before the king, and asked and petitioned him to allow the freedom of religion. He could have been snatched. His wife didn't know if he's going to come back or not. And yet God, in his prevailing grace and sovereignty, brought him back. So I trust that you'll take some time to seriously pray about just the opportunities, as Trevor shared, and opportunities, and as we have this history and what he's called each of us to do as those who are his. Father, thank you for this morning, and thank you, Father, for the testimony of Adoniram, of Anne, of Lord, of Sarah and Emily and many others who were with him, that had gone with him and died. He had buried many colleagues, and yet he was faithful to the end. And so it is, we pray, Father, that God, you would raise up, Lord, others from here, and not just even to go, but to be faithful to the work that you've called us to here. In Jesus' name, amen.